I'm Rod Giltaca. I'm the CEO of the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. The Canadian government is banning guns. But did they base their decision on real evidence? Or is the truth a lot different than Canadians think? We're about to find out.
Gun Ban Canada.
Welcome to the final episode of Gun Ban Canada Exposed. In this series, we've examined the foundational elements of the Liberal Party's controversial Bill C-71, the massive May 1st gun ban, and the most recent Bill C-21. This show was an incredible, groundbreaking project. Never before has anyone assembled this much information on this topic in this format. The most important thing that you can do is share this information. You can find it here on Wild TV as well as the CCFR YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for CCFR channel. Tonight, we'll look back on everything we've learned. We'll get some updates from some past guests, and we'll cover some important topics that we simply didn't have time for in the original episodes. So let's get started. In episode 1, we talked about the government's claim that the only reason for all of this is public safety. This is what they've repeated over and over and over again.
In the coming days, everyone in this House will have an opportunity to do their job and to keep Canadians safe.
We are all highly motivated by our commitments to keep people safe.
I'm motivated only by keeping people safe, and that's the discussion I had with my party and with my Prime Minister.
It is always a good moment to move forward on measures that keep Canadians safe.
There is strong support to do what is required to keep Canadians safe.
But we're reflecting on the continued responsibility we have to ensure that Canadians remain safe in their homes, in their streets, and in their communities.
Because we have a responsibility to keep citizens safe.
In keeping Canadians safe, though, virtually all of this new regulation is exclusively focused on licensed gun owners. These are the Canadians who would apply for, qualify for, and maintain a license to legally own firearms. There's almost 2.3 million of these people in Canada. These are some of the most vetted and scrutinized people in our country. How do you justify this? Are licensed gun owners the reason why we have firearm-related violence? You'd think that it has to be. The government's set to spend billions of dollars and tens of thousands of man-hours pursuing these people in particular. And they're confiscating hundreds of thousands of rifles and shotguns that have been peacefully owned in Canada, in some cases for over 70 years. In episode 1, the point we were trying to make was if the government is so concerned about firearm-related violent crime, homicide, and suicide, what other steps have they taken to reduce these things? I'm sure they've done all of the easy common sense things that they could before resorting to taking licensed gun owners' property away. One of the most common sense measures we highlighted was the horrifying lack of action on behalf of the government regarding suicide.
988, 3 digits that could make all the difference in saving lives in Canada as it could in the US. It's the mental health equivalent of 911. If you look at the many ways that people end their lives, guns would be only a small part of it. So I really wish the federal government would focus much more on something positive. I reached out to all the federal cabinet ministers who are involved in their portfolios in suicide prevention. I reached out to MPs and senators, and I was really quite amazed that all I got was silence on the other end. And I have always said that silence is not the right response when suicide is the subject.
All Canadians could have used the support of a 988 system over the last year, the year of the pandemic, and long before that. But no one could be bothered to implement, let's say, a $5 million decision to help hundreds of thousands of distressed Canadians. The good news is, about 2 months after we aired episode 1, the House of Commons passed a motion to move forward with the implementation of 988. This was a result of the tireless efforts of people like Kathleen Finlay and help from Conservative MP Todd Doherty. It's not done yet, but we're happy that it's moving forward. This one measure on its own will likely save more lives than any gun ban ever would. When we come back, we'll continue our journey through the twists and turns of the government's offensive on firearm ownership. Stay with us. Welcome back. Also in episode 1, we met an inspiring advocate in the Greater Toronto area, Marcel Wilson. Marcel is an ex-gang leader turned prominent community figure doing everything that he can to reduce gang-related violence in some of Canada's most dangerous communities.
And I reached out to several, gang leaders and organized crime figures here, domestic, here at home, that I had connections with from my past life or people that I had met through other people. And we decided to bring this group together and form the One by One movement.
Roughly 55% of firearm-related homicide in Canada is connected to gang activity, and even more connected to the illicit drug trade. And indications are that close to all of the public shootings in Canada have that connection as well. Like, think about that for a second. The most important thing that we could do right now as a society to cut firearm-related homicides in half and almost completely eliminate public shootings is deal decisively with our gang problems. Public Safety Minister Bill Blair, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, they know these things. There's ample information on it from sources like Statistics Canada, a government agency, but it gets worse. After an incredible amount of effort and support from the community itself, Marcel Wilson's One by One movement here in 2021 still has not received any significant funding from the federal government. Apparently, there are hundreds of millions of tax dollars circulating around to address these problems. Money promised from all the way back in 2015, 6 years ago.
Far too many communities have felt the sting and the pain of gun and gang violence.
But we'll be coming forward in the coming weeks with significant new measures to invest in communities, invest in kids, and to deal more appropriately and effectively with the gangs responsible for much of the violence in our community.
We started by investing $327 million over 5 years to counter gang and gun violence.
Hand in hand with our investment of $327 million over 5 years, rising to $100 million every year thereafter to intensify our battle against guns and gangs.
We have invested $327 million in a strategy directly aimed at guns and gangs.
We have tried to reach out to the federal government in particular, and we were, made promises by certain politicians, but when it came down to tackling the issues that we wanted to deal with, which was dealing with root cause issues that lead to these extreme acts of violence, they twisted the narrative on us halfway through and really started focusing on gun bans.
The question on every concerned mind should be, where's all this money? Who has it? This is hundreds of millions of dollars. We reached out to Minister Blair's office to see where this money's gone, and here's what they sent back. After 6 years, excluding funds given to law enforcement, somewhere around $90 million has been allocated. I thought it was $327 million over 5 years and $100 million per year after that. By now, $300 to $400 million should have been distributed, funding worthwhile programs and reducing firearm-related violence. After all, this was and is a public safety emergency. It certainly is for the people who live in these affected communities. Even so, around $90 million has been dispersed. That's a lot of money. How is it that a highly qualified, highly respected community leader like Marcel Wilson and the obviously worthy One by One movement has received no funding for a single program? We asked Minister Blair's office for the funding agreements they signed, but we were told that we'd have to file access to information requests to see them. Interesting. So a lot of announcements, lots of election promises, a fair bit of secrecy, but shockingly, it doesn't look like much is getting done. Again, over 6 years. At the same time, banning thousands of models of long guns from licensed individuals was such a pressing issue that it was done without debate or an act of Parliament in the middle of a pandemic. If this all sounds suspicious and disingenuous to you, you're not alone. For those of you keeping score at home, we still don't have a 988 system in operation, a program that could greatly reduce suicides of all kinds, not just with firearms. And it seems that the gang wars are raging on, but gun bans are getting done just fine. convincing Canadian voters to believe that the Liberals are banning guns for the right reasons is their most important priority. To do that, they have to make Canadians believe that licensed gun owners are the problem. We'll have a look at what we uncovered in episode 2 when we come back. In episode 2, we had a close look at where crime guns in Canada come from. Why? Because another way that the Liberals are trying to justify taking legal guns away from licensed Canadians is to try to blame them for providing criminals with their guns. This is all part of the claim that Canada's crime guns are being sourced domestically.
The police in Surrey, British Columbia, and the police in Toronto, they would have said 3 to 5 years ago the major source was smuggling operations coming in from the United States. But they believe the nature of the source has changed so that there is less smuggling in from the United States and more domestic sourcing of illegal weapons through, for example, break-ins that steal perfectly legal guns and put them into the black market in Canada. So the police have said the nature of the source is different now than it was 5 years ago.
The 3 ways in which guns get into the hands of criminals are smuggled across the border. We also know that many of the guns are being stolen from lawful gun owners. Some of those guns are being purchased legally and then sold illegally for an enormous profit.
New measures to detect and deter and punish straw purchase, that's a legal owner purchasing a gun and then selling it illegally, are what the police need.
In episode 2, we found statements and data from Statistics Canada and various police services, including the RCMP, that proved the government was misinforming Canadians about the origins of crime guns at best, and at worst, intentionally deceiving the public about it.
Can you tell us today where they come from? Do they come over the U.S. border? Do they come from elsewhere? Because it's illegal arms that are the problem.
We still don't know the origin of firearms used during firearms-related crime in Canada. Are they coming from Canada or from the United States? Have they been stolen by somebody who owned them legally or illegally? Were they imported or purchased legally? We don't know.
A couple of years earlier, in 2016, Inspector Chris McBrien, then head of the Western Canada Division of NWest, the National Weapons Enforcement Team, all part of the RCMP, was quoted as saying, quote, "It is a fact that the majority of gun-related crimes in our communities are committed with guns that are domestically sourced," end quote. Evan Dyer of CBC News reported that when he asked the RCMP for data behind this definitive statement, the RCMP replied that no such data exists. Quote, Inspector McBrien's statement would have been based on information available to him at the time. However, this information would not have provided a complete national picture of the sources of crime guns, as no such data exists, end quote, says a statement from the RCMP. Sergeant Marie Damien goes on to say, quote, "Currently, there is no national repository for this type of information in Canada. The Canadian Firearms Program does not collect or track national statistics with regard to the origin of crime guns," end quote.
As a journalist and gun owner in Canada, I see a lot of confusion about where it is that guns used in crime here in Canada came from. They come from primarily 3 sources. In order of quantity, they are first and foremost smuggled in across the border, mainly from the United States, with whom we share the longest unprotected border in the world. That accounts for about 70% of the guns used. Now, it depends on where the guns are being trafficked or who's doing the trafficking, but for the most part, these are gangs or at the least organized crime responsible for it. The next source, averaging about 30%, are guns that are stolen from licensed gun owners. Now, the government's position is essentially that because this is happening, we should just ban them altogether. But what we're really talking about here is garden variety property crime. It's wrong. Crack down on the property crime epidemic, especially in rural areas, and you eliminate the problem of these stolen guns being used in crime. And that comes with the added bonus that good citizens don't need to fear their property being taken from them. Might be something to consider. And finally, there's straw purchasing. This is when a licensed gun owner buys a gun for someone who is unlicensed. Now, this is exceedingly rare, hardly ever happens at all. In fact, Alberta in 2018 convicted a gun owner of this in the first ever of such convictions in Canada. At least that's how the Crown prosecutor put it. So straw purchasing, from a statistical perspective, is a non-issue.
So the actual facts are, the overwhelming majority of crime guns come from other countries, primarily the United States. A distant second place are stolen guns, which is actually property crime. Solve your property crime problem and you've solved your stolen gun problem. And a far distant last place, straw purchasing, an activity, while completely unacceptable, very rarely happens in Canada. The claim that the majority of crime guns come from domestic sources and the only way to deal with it is to ban guns is clearly false. It's a lie. Canadians have owned handguns and long guns for literally centuries. Why now, all of a sudden, it's the fault of legal gun owners that we have violence? It's a serious question, and it certainly seems like there's a lot more going on here. When we come back, the government is pulling out all the stops when it comes to trying to convince Canadians that we just can't be trusted with guns. They've even enlisted the help of medical doctors in pushing this narrative. They say more guns in a society means that there'll be more gun deaths. Is that really true? We'll find out. Stay with us. Back in December 2020, we aired Gun Ban Canada Exposed Episode 3, Do More Guns Equal More Death? The episode focused on the relentless claim that the proliferation of firearms is the reason for firearm-related death, particularly homicide and suicide.
The recent literature is unequivocal that injury, homicide, and suicide by guns happens more in jurisdictions and countries where there are more guns. And we know that countries with stricter gun laws have lower rates of gun homicide, suicide, femicide, intentional and unintentional injury. The evidence is very clear. More guns, more harm, more injury, more death. I ask you, Prime Minister, and all of our elected officials to consider the weight of the scientific evidence that clearly shows the proliferation of guns makes us all less safe.
It is not my assertion. This is information and data that has been replicated in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, in county after county, province after province, country after country. There is now an abundant and irrefutable body of international data and information and study which supports. This is not my assertion. This is the assertion of scientists and doctors and physicians who study this problem. And we are here only to inform you in your study so that you can make better decisions that will help ensure the health and longevity of our children and our sisters and our brothers. That's the reason we're here.
Episode 3 was an incredibly important show. Please take the time to watch it because it directly contradicted the testimony you just heard. In short, we showed that some jurisdictions with few or virtually no gun laws, but plenty of guns, have very low firearm-related suicide and homicide, while jurisdictions with heavy regulations and even gun bans are some of the most dangerous places on earth. And one of the most interesting parts of all this is that you don't need to be a doctor or a politician to see it. Yes, we are all smart enough to evaluate some things for ourselves. A leading anti-gun advocate recently stated in a magazine article that we rank very poorly on gun mortality rates, much closer to the US than to other developed countries. This advocate is a Canadian doctor, in fact, a trauma surgeon. She must be a trustworthy source of information. Unfortunately, here's the truth. The average firearm mortality rate of 40 countries with lower rates in Canada is 1.1 per 100,000 citizens. Canada's rate is roughly 2.2 per 100,000. The US, 12.21 per 100,000. So Canada ranks closer to the US than its peers in other developed countries. Obviously, this couldn't be less true. The fact that this kind of information is coming from anti-gun advocates and worse, a doctor, is beyond troubling. But this isn't the only science she quoted in that particular article. Following along the lines of more guns equal more deaths, she also declares that a child is injured by a gun every day in Ontario. She made the same claim as testimony to the Canadian Senate. Again, I strongly encourage you to watch episode 3 in its entirety. But let's examine a few more interesting numbers that just don't line up with the claims of politicians and activist doctors. The University of Sydney School of Public Health provided the figures we're going to be looking at. They took information from sources such as StatCan and the FBI Uniform Crime Report, to mention a few. In episode 3, we reviewed a lot of this information. But now that we have the opportunity, let's have a closer look at some of them. Let's look at what's going on in the countries with the most guns. The United States has the most legally held firearms per 100 people in the world at 120.5. That's a lot of guns. Their firearm-related homicide rate is the highest among high-income countries at 4.46 per 100,000. Now, mind you, 4.46 is nowhere near as high as, let's say, Jamaica at 38.2 homicides per 100,000. And Jamaica only has 8 guns per 100 people, not 120. But let's continue with comparing apples to apples. Interestingly, most of the countries with the most legal guns have some of the lowest firearm-related death numbers in the world. It's a fact. Take a look. Here are the top 20 countries in the world with the most legally held guns. Now, there are so many interesting numbers here, we could spend an hour just trying to make sense of them. And as always, and it's good to remember, these numbers are not the whole story. Starting at home, Canada has roughly 35 guns per 100 people, and our combined rate of firearm-related death, both suicide and homicide, is 1.94 per 100,000. This group here has roughly the same number of legal guns circulating around in their society. If you compare Canada's homicide number with Germany's is 8 times lower, and they have roughly the same number of guns as we do. How can that be if the more guns in circulation, the more gun violence you'll have in your society? What about comparing Austria and Germany? They're right next door to each other. Austria's death rate is more than twice that of Germany, and they have the same number of guns. Again, how can that be? Now, to be fair, these are all very low numbers, so a handful of deaths can skew these numbers significantly. And this happens in Canada quite often as well, but still, it's worth considering. Here's a really interesting question. How is it the United Kingdom, a country that has only 2.8 guns per 100 people, have a firearm-related homicide rate roughly the same as Germany's, at 32 guns per 100 people, or Norway? What about Iceland? They have roughly the same number of guns per person as Canada, yet they had no firearm-related homicides in 2012. None. The truth is, firearm-related death has more to do with everything else in a society than it does with legally owned firearms. So how can anybody, much less a doctor or a group of doctors, say, it's the guns, the debate is over, it's only about the guns? It's not true. And it's wrong for politicians and medical doctors to mislead Canadians, no matter what their motive is. When are we as a country ready to have an honest, mature conversation about these problems? Is the problem population density? Is it proximity to the United States? Is there more drug trafficking here? Is our country's culture more or less violent than other countries? Is it socioeconomic conditions or social cohesion? Does it have to do with the social safety net? These are the real questions, the ones being asked by serious people. When we come back, we're going to have an unusually honest look at one of the most terrifying events anyone could be affected by, multiple victim public shootings. Stay with us. In the national conversation about guns, nothing seizes the attention of the public more effectively than mass shootings, otherwise known as multiple victim public shootings. The unimaginable horror and often random nature of these events strike fear into most people, specifically the idea that it could happen anytime, anywhere. No one wants to play a part in making these shootings easier to carry out, and no one is ignoring the tragic nature of these events. But if we want to prevent or mitigate these things, we need to be rational and honest about them. There's no room in this conversation for politics or disinformation. The number of mass shootings, or how often they can occur, can be misleading. What makes them misleading is how governments define them. Often it's a shooting that involves the death of 4 or more people. For tonight, we're going to ignore that number because it excludes certain significant shootings in Canada. And these particular shootings need to be included and examined for a variety of reasons if we're really going to look at this honestly. And by the way, we're not going to say the names of any of the perpetrators. Multiple victim public shootings don't happen very often in Canada. In fact, there have been between 9 and 17 of these events since 1967, again, depending on how you define them. Also, keep in mind an estimated 86 Canadians have been killed in mass shootings over the last 55 years. Again, these were all innocent people who didn't deserve to become victims of these terrible crimes. The worst mass shooting in Canadian history was at École Polytechnique in Montreal in 1989. In roughly 20 minutes, 28 people were shot, 1 stabbed, and 14 of them died. It was one of the darkest days in Canadian history. The police that arrived on scene waited outside and set up containment. No one entered until long after the perpetrator shot himself. He had ammunition and ample time left to do even more damage. Thankfully, he didn't have that chance. It's common for these perpetrators to kill themselves at the end of their rampages or plan to be killed by police at some point. The shooting at École Polytechnique inspired Canada's steady march towards more gun control. The idea, of course, is that if guns were more difficult to get, there would be fewer mass killings. In the aftermath at Polytechnique, much of the focus on this crime was on the firearm used. Gun control advocates called it an assault rifle, and to this day claim that nobody needs a gun like that. Objective observers and gun owners claim that crimes like these have everything to do with the motivation of the killer. However, to be fair, does the type of gun make a difference? In Shell Lake, Saskatchewan in 1967, a paranoid schizophrenic randomly killed a family of 9 people, leaving 1 survivor using a .22 caliber rifle. This firearm was not an assault rifle. In 1975 in Brampton, Ontario, Canada had its first school shooting, where a 16-year-old student killed 2 and wounded 13 using a lever action rifle and a .22. These firearms were not assault rifles either. The Edmonton shooting in 2012 was committed with a handgun. The perpetrator killed 9 people. The evidence does not support the idea that the type of firearm has a significant bearing on the number of people killed in these events or making a mass attack more likely to happen. In Dr. Teresa Sauer's coroner report on the events at Polytechnique, she made some conclusions about the firearm used. The issue of firearms control has intentionally not been addressed. With the unlimited ammunition and the time that the shooter had available to him, he would probably have been able to achieve similar results even with a conventional hunting weapon, which itself is readily accessible. Despite the constant debates about firearms, some of Canada's worst attacks were committed without firearms. In 1972, using a couple of dollars worth of gasoline, 37 people were killed and 64 injured in the Montreal nightclub arson attack. 3 men attacked the nightclub because they were refused entry as they were too intoxicated. In the case of the Toronto van attack, we don't even know if the perpetrator bothered to look into getting a firearms license or obtaining a firearm. He simply needed a valid credit card and $80 to rent a van for a day. He was able to kill 10 unsuspecting and innocent Canadians and injure 16 more. If a firearm were used, this would have been the 3rd largest mass shooting in Canadian history. So if not the type of gun, what are the factors that determine how effective a multiple victim public shooting is? What we know, looking at every such shooting in Canada, is that it comes down to the level of planning the perpetrator does, the level of confinement the victims are subject to, the police response, though that only applies when the shooting continues for an extended period, and finally, whether or not anyone at the scene is able to intervene in any effective way. Many in law enforcement know that mass killings are a reality no matter how they're carried out, and they've evolved the way that they respond to these events. Many agencies no longer wait to enter buildings while these things are happening. Once more than one officer shows up, they form a team and enter. It seems they've come to a conclusion about the only way to stop these shootings. It's to get more guns into the building. Of course, that flies in the face of the mantra, more guns equal more death. Now, you might say that when it comes to mass shootings, more guns equal less death. There's no doubt that there are people watching this right now who are thinking, well, that sounds like a gun lobby talking point. But there's no way around it. It's physically true. So have we seen examples of this in Canada? Yes, we have. And we'll take an honest look at them when we come back. In 2006, there was another school shooting in Montreal at Dawson College. This event was very different than the one at École Polytechnique. This perpetrator had multiple weapons and a substantial supply of ammunition. One young promising student was killed and 19 others were injured. At Polytechnique, the shooter had one rifle and a hunting knife. 28 people were shot and 14 died. Why were the outcomes so different? The first observation is that much of the shooting at Dawson College occurred outside and then in a cafeteria. At Polytechnique, the perpetrator engaged many of the victims in confined areas such as classrooms and hallways. But most significantly, in the shooting at École Polytechnique, the perpetrator had complete control of the crime scene until he himself decided his rampage was over. In contrast, when the shooting at Dawson College started, 2 Montreal policemen happened to be on scene for another matter and ran toward the sound of the gunfire. Officer Denis Cote was able to place a shot that struck the shooter in the arm. The perpetrator subsequently committed suicide with the handgun he had brought with him. One can only imagine how long this shooting would have gone on if someone with a gun hadn't been there to intervene. And thankfully, these 2 officers put themselves at deadly risk and didn't simply set up containment and wait for backup. No one knows how many lives were saved as a result. The shocking 2014 Parliament Hill shooting provides another interesting example. The perpetrator used a lever-action hunting rifle. The shooter was able to run all over downtown Ottawa into the Parliament building, killing 1 and injuring 3. How did this shooting end? Multiple people with firearms were able to pin down the killer and neutralize him. Imagine if no one in the Parliament had a gun. And how did the Canadian government react to this shooting, by the way? Every PPS officer now carries a gun, where they didn't before. They increased the number of guns on Parliament Hill by, who knows, 20 times? For many people, these are incredibly painful memories. But if we truly want to save lives, then we need to examine these events and try to figure out what we can learn from them. In jurisdictions where people can protect themselves with firearms, we see similar outcomes to this. On December 9, 2007, at around midnight, a man armed with a rifle and 2 handguns shot 4 people at a youth missionary in Arvada, Colorado, killing 2 of them. At around 1 p.m. the same day, he showed up at the New Life Church in Colorado Springs. According to the New Life Church, there were roughly 7,000 people on the property at the time. The shooting started when the perpetrator shot another 4 people in the parking lot, again killing 2 of them. He then made his way into the church foyer and shot another person. At this point, this man was in a position to commit the largest mass shooting in U.S. history. However, before he got more than 15 feet inside the building, he was shot multiple times by Jean Assam, who had volunteered to work security at the church. She was a legal gun owner. And thankfully, Colorado allows citizens to carry firearms for the purpose of protection. The church's pastor, Brady Boyd, believes Assam saved over 100 lives that day. 7,000 people in a confined area? I think it's very reasonable to think that she saved many more than that. Another example occurred in Panama City, Florida in 2010. A distraught man stood up at a school board meeting and spray painted a V on the wall. He then pulled out a handgun and declared, among other things, that he was going to die today. He suffered from bipolar disorder and was motivated by his wife losing her job as a school bus driver, therefore losing her pay and her benefits. The man ordered everyone out of the room except the members of the board and made clear his intent was to kill everyone in the room, including himself. After a brief exchange with one of the board members, he opened fire. But just after the first shot, school security officer Mike Jones engaged him with several rounds, causing the perpetrator to fall to the ground and immediately commit suicide. Just like in Colorado, Florida has strong concealed carry laws that allowed Mike Jones to carry even on school property. A minimum of 6 lives were saved that day, important lives. There are numerous other examples, including the shooting at the West Freeway Church in Texas in 2019, where church security volunteer Jack Wilson acted in seconds to stop a man who opened fire with a pump-action shotgun during Sunday services. 2 congregation members died, but Jack Wilson, another armed church volunteer, saved countless others, important lives. From the first shot to the last, this particular incident was over in 6 seconds. 6 seconds. Imagine for a moment that the shooting at Polytechnic was over in 6 seconds. To be fair, it's not a perfect analogy, but just entertain the thought just for a minute. Many of those young women would be alive today, and many more wouldn't have been injured. As I mentioned in episode 3, the purpose of this discussion is not to sell the idea of concealed carry to Canadians. There's a clear case for it. There's no dispute that it saves lives. There's a lot of data on it. We talked about all that in episode 3. But what we are talking about here are the realities of multiple victim public shootings. Gun control advocates use these kinds of events to promote gun bans. And you know what? It's effective. Because no living, feeling human being wants to see these things happen, much less be a part in letting them happen more easily. But the reality is that a mass shooting can be effectively carried out with any kind of firearm, from a .22 to a handgun to a semi-auto rifle or a pump-action shotgun. There are over 1 billion firearms in circulation in the world today, 20 million in Canada alone. The supply of firearms is not drying up anytime soon. A ban on so-called military assault weapons is a distraction. It's a political game. It won't stop people from committing mass attacks with or without firearms. When we come back, we'll wrap up this final episode of Gun Ban Canada Exposed. Stay with us. Welcome back. One of the most important episodes we did in this series was episode 6. We explored why even in this day and age, Canadians find themselves in a position where they don't know who or what to believe. Near the end of episode 6, we featured a revolting series of statements from the current Minister of Public Safety, Bill Blair.
The Conservative leader has promised the gun lobby that he will weaken gun control. He has, for example, the gun lobby tells us that he's promised them that he'll make assault rifles legal again, that he'll remove the restrictions on handguns, that he'll eliminate all controls over large capacity magazines, that he'll eliminate stronger background checks, that he'll allow carry concealed weapons. The gun lobby has said very clearly that they've told the Conservative leader what he's to do, and he's agreed to do it.
Roughly speaking, his entire statement was a lie. It was pure deception. No one watching this needs me to tell them why this is destructive to our society and our country. The day after he originally said this, I made a video documenting and exposing this. It was viewed over 100,000 times. You'd think that this would be embarrassing to Blair and his superiors, but you'd be wrong. A few weeks later, during the Liberal Party convention, he said this.
We're seeing ideologically motivated violent extremists who are using online platforms to propagate and advocate for hatred and violence against women, against religious minorities, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, and hateful speech, and advocating violence. And we can use these red flag laws because I will tell you, many of those extremists, not every person who's in the gun lobby is an extremist, but everybody in the extremist is in the gun lobby.
Again, roughly speaking, Blair says the worst, most hateful, most dangerous people in Canada are all of them, in the gun lobby. This is the ex-police chief of Toronto, a sitting government minister. Any reasonable person should be appalled by this. Unsurprisingly, not one mainstream media outlet mentioned this. Not one. There are so many more examples, so much more to highlight, but we just don't have time to cover it all. In closing, many casual gun owners think all this is no big deal. They think that the government and the anti-gun organizations will stop just short of banning the guns that they own. Look at how far this has gone in 5 years. In fact, one of the key members of the anti-gun doctors group recently made this statement about hunting.
I think it's time to accept what Canadians are saying, which is, the days of, hunting for your family and providing for your family. Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent it happens, but let's be real. People do not go and, shoot 20 deer and feed their family venison every night. First of all, the family would reject that because venison's not that great. And so it's time, I think, that we acknowledge what Canadians are saying, which is, the days of the pioneer lifestyle, they're long since gone.
The Liberal government is literally using medical doctors to get Canadians to go along with ending firearm ownership and next hunting. And rest assured, if they're confronted about this statement, they'll backpedal. They don't want to risk all 2.3 million firearm owners standing together on this issue. They're careful. They want to eliminate one segment of our community at a time.
There's absolutely nothing in our platform proposals that in any way restricts the legitimate, lawful, and safe activities of hunting and sport shooting in this country. There's nothing in our platform today that is intended to interfere with the legitimate, lawful activities of hunting and sport shooting in Canada.
I want to assure hunters and farmers and target shooters in this country that nothing that we are doing today or will do in the future is intended to interfere with this lawful, responsible, and legal activity.
The firearms issue isn't the only thing going wrong in Canada right now, but it's a critical indicator of a larger problem. Among other things, there's a war on the idea that you can own anything. These are called property rights. Many Canadian politicians gleefully remind the working class that we have no right to own anything, much less firearms.
I appreciate his pointing out that we do not have in this country rights to bear arms. I also note that under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we don't have rights to property at all.
The only way to stop all of this, or at least even slow it down, is to hold politicians and Canada's political parties accountable. Don't vote for them if they lie to you. Don't vote for them if they want to take your freedoms from you or from other people. If the media is lying to you, just turn it off. Only you and the people that you know who are eligible to vote can stop this. That's the only way. Stand shoulder to shoulder with your fellow gun owners, whether you're a hunter or a sport shooter. Whether you own a lever-action rifle or a black semi-auto rifle, these are the only friends you have. Don't divide yourselves so that you become powerless. You can start taking action by sharing this information. You can find it here on WOW TV, as well as at the CCFR YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for CCFR channel. You can become a member of the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights, the CCFR. You can support the CCFR's federal lawsuit attempting to save your property rights. You can do all of this by visiting us at firearmrights.ca. That's firearmrights.ca. Thanks to the team at WOW TV for having the courage to produce and air this show. Thanks to the members of the CCFR for bringing you Gun Ban Canada Exposed. And thank you for watching. Stay safe and good luck to us all.